Clive Barker was actively seeking a place for himself in the North American literature scene when none other than Stephen King uttered his name in October of 1984. It was at the World Fantasy Convention in Ottawa, Canada, where King was asked about horror fiction writers on the rise. Well, he took the opportunity to ask for a show of hands if they'd heard of a writer by the name of Clive Barker. Well, very few hands went up. Now, soon thereafter, Barker's publisher asked King if they could quote his words from the convention. King gave his permission. These words would live on the cover of Barker's debut book of short stories, echoing with a rite of passage any horror fan had to pass in order to call oneself a true fan of horror fiction. The quote, "I have seen the future of horror, and its name is Clive Barker." Welcome to House of Words, a podcast about writers, horror, and short stories. I am your host, Jason Nemore Harden, inviting you to join us on this October special as we explore Clive Barker and the creation of his first blood-soaked stories, Books of Blood. Clive Barker came into this world on October 5, 1952 as the first child to Leonard and Joan Baker in Liverpool, England. 3.5 years later, on February 24, 1956, his brother Roy Barker was born. Now, Liverpool in 1952 was something very different than it is today. 7 years after the end of World War II, the city was still scrambling to pick up the pieces, making it a rather desolate and sad place. The city suffered severely from the bombs that rained down on it. Consequently, quite a few of those sites still existed. Now, in many ways, it was a scary place, a violent city, a city where, to put it mildly, racial tensions were evident, a city where poverty was manifest. Now, Clive's birth had its share of complications, ending with a cesarean. Now, Joan didn't come home with her son until 14 days after the birth. Now, in 1950s England, cesarean births were arduous procedures for mothers, and despite her perfect health, her recovery was slow. Now, later in life, Clive partially attributed his fascination with and terror of the sight of blood to the complicated circumstances surrounding his birth. Of this, he said, "I was a cesarean birth, and Mother and I nearly died, and I was stuck upside down for a long time. There was a series of traumatic first impressions of the world, which I believe have become a leitmotif of terror for me. A lot of noise, panicked voices, even if they have nothing to do with me. I think the first few minutes of my life were just horrible, and worse for Mom, in that she was unable to hold me. And then when we both did survive, there was this fierceness, an absolute sort of, I'm never going to let you go on both sides, still expressed. And the sight of blood makes my body change. I break into a cold sweat. I shake, not all the time, but under the weirdest circumstances. There have been PG-13 movies in which something, a gunshot would, or a certain rhythm of the shot just shock me, make me shake. And then, of course, there are elaborate grand guignol, things where I don't give a flying fuck. I thoroughly enjoy them. Now, there's something primal there, and the only thing I can figure out is that it's because of these terrible circumstances of the very, very beginning of my life." He spent the first 14 years of his life in the suburbs of Penny Lane. Then in 1966, just as the Beatles were becoming a worldwide phenomenon, the family moved to Oakdale Road. Oakdale Road was a classic British working-class neighborhood, which seemed to be a gray contrast to the blue skies of Penny Lane. Now, many of Clive's memories of the place were of textures and vague impressions. He'd remember seeing an eclipse from his backyard. He would later recall burning summers and the ominous feelings they would manifest. Now, he referred to summers in a lot of his writing, exploring that foreboding feeling that he felt connected with summers. Now, given that writing is often a form of escapism or a way to exorcise demons, the question of what he was trying to escape from or exorcise has often come up. Or for Clive and his parents, who also received the question, it was difficult to answer, since according to the three of them, his childhood was nothing short of unexceptional. But that was part of its pleasure, Clive noted. That goes to show that, unlike many writers, he was not trying to exorcise emotions nor demons from the past, but was evolving into a creative creature in his own right. Now, despite his own theories about the consequences following his difficult birth, he was not interested in explaining the pull towards the macabre and horrific through conventional psychology. In his own words, because it seems to me that, although they may not always be spurious, they are always going to be reductionist. Motives are more complicated than one could ever express. So all you end up doing is telling part of the truth. If you say, well, I had a terrible experience when my dog was run over, and I started writing horror fiction because of it, that's never going to be the whole truth. I don't like the notion of hanging motive upon certain key events, as though the mind isn't, as I perceive it to be, a fluid, infinite series of associations. Now, he pondered the idea of whether there are ground rules about the way minds are created. If maybe some minds come wired differently. In particular, this is interesting as he himself admits that his taste wasn't shaped by any traumatic event in childhood, or any good event for that matter. He remembered strange things from childhood, of course, but nothing that left a longer impression in that sense. He was creative and imaginative, however. His imagination had a considerable range, from very fanciful light material to rather dark material. Clive had a reputation for being a dreamer. He was known to have imaginary friends. He had a fondness for monsters, a fondness of drawing monsters. But then again, many kids like monsters, and many do like to draw them. A very precocious and very imaginative child, he was his mother's pride and joy. According to his mother, his ability to speak was perfect by age 2. Perhaps this can be linked to the fact that neither of his parents simplified adult language when speaking to him. Even as an infant, most of the adults in his life spoke to him as if he was an adult. Now, perhaps it was that his mother made up stories to tell him on a nightly basis. He adored his mother's riverbank tales. However, his first and true love was the story of Peter Pan. He later said that Peter Pan was the book he wanted to be buried with. He was so captivated by the story that around the age of 6 or 7, he imagined himself as one of the Lost Boys, longing to fly away from Liverpool into Never Never Land. Now, he never considered his childhood life especially eventful or out of the ordinary. His younger brother Roy, however, even at an early age, felt that Clive was somewhat different. By this, he quite likely was referring to the fact that his older brother didn't play very much with other kids. Truth be told, he appeared to be much more comfortable all by himself. He would spend hours alone, reading, drawing, or just simply thinking, wondering whether Never Never Land might truly be a place, and of course, speculating how to get there. Quote, all I've ever wanted to do is darken the day and brighten the night. End quote. The natural progression of Clive Barker's fascination with the written word expanded into comic books. He became an avid reader and collector, using most of his money in Bascom's, a retail shop on Smithdown Road that sold second-hand comic books. Bascom's left a deep impression in the memory chambers of his mind. I still dream about that place, he commented, further explaining how it was a tiny store with toffees and sweets in jars, as well as racks of magazines. Now, on the floor, in a cardboard box, he found random frayed issues of Marvel and DC Comics, whose bright colors and superhero themes were far different from the black and white, more juvenile comic books being published in England at the time. Now, these were what his imagination was aching for. Now, throughout childhood, he would go through countless cycles of collecting issues, selling them, regretting the sale, and finally recollecting them. Well, after comics, horror and fantasy would soon follow, becoming a constant companion after he was exposed to the works of Edgar Allan Poe. The Mask of the Red Death became a favorite. Now, his early reading in the realm of horror fiction was, for the most part, traditional and devoted to the classics. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, aka the modern Prometheus, Robert Louis Stevenson's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and Bram Stoker's Dracula were firm staples. He also dove into the fiction of Arthur McKim, M.R. James, and Dennis Wheatley. Edgar Allan Poe, however, remained his greatest childhood influence as he continued to find dread and delight in stories such as The Fall of the House of Usher, The Cask of Amontillado, and The Murders in the Rue Morgue. The world of horror literature would spill over to the world of comics when he purchased a 2 shillings and 6 pence edition of Tales of Mystery and Imagination. And the issue had a house, a lurid red sky, and a skull glowering over it. Next, he stumbled upon a couple issues of EC Comics, which his parents really did not approve of. Nevertheless, his mind continued to suck it all in like a sponge. And then came a turning point: movies. Now, the placards for these films affected him long before he was actually able to watch them. But consequently, due to his expansive imagination, the movies were often a disappointment to him. His imagination was, however, more than fulfilled in his first experience with an adult horror film, Alfred Hitchcock's classic, Psycho. Now, the local cinema was featuring a double bill of Psycho and George Pal's The War of the Worlds. The British Board of Film Classification had plastered X certificates on both, restricting attendance to those 18 years and older. Now, at the time, Barker and his friend Norman were approximately 14, 15 years old. They decided that this movie would be the next stepping stone in their development. So they rolled up handkerchiefs and put them in the soles of their shoes to look taller. Well, Norman, whose weight added a certain credibility, was selected to purchase the tickets. It worked. Now, upon entering the cinema, Clive hiding behind his bigger friend, they soon realized that they had miscalculated the time and had arrived with only 15 minutes remaining. Thus, just in time to see Mother Bates turn around and reveal herself. So there they sat, with sweaty palms, taking in the experience as Psycho came to an end, and thus began the second feature. Then, The War of the Worlds reached its end, and thus Psycho began again. Now, more than the action on the screen, there were 4 girls sitting in the row in front of him that captivated his attention. Slow down, not for the reasons you're thinking. Now, as the shrieks and screams echoed through the cinema, he remembers thinking that, opposed to the girls in front, he was in control the second time around because he knew what was coming on the screen. It was a feeling of power to some extent. Now, instead of looking at the screen, he kept his eyes on the girls, looking as they squirmed, shrieked, screamed, and giggled. Sitting there, he realized that he wanted to conjure up those same reactions in people. Now, concerning his love for the movie, Clive would later comment, "There is a small movie house at the back of my head where it's been running ever since." Quote, "One of the things I'm trying to do over and over again in my books is create new mythologies, create new ways to understand the complexity of the world. I think what mythology does is impress upon chaotic experience the patterns, hierarchies, and shapes which allow us to interpret the chaos and make fresh sense of it." End quote. Clive Barker has kept a rigorous writing schedule for most of his career, putting in an astonishing 8 to 12 hours a day. An early riser, typically around 5 a.m., those first hours are when he feels most receptive to the creative energies that drive him. Now, writing in longhand, he produces 2,500 to 3,000 words daily, and that's despite the constant phone calls from publishers and movie studios. He divides his time between painting and writing scripts, with writing getting the largest slice of the time. He may take an hour or two off in the middle of the day. However, he does what he can to avoid meeting with or seeing people or any other endeavors during those breaks that may take him away from the desk for any length of time. He maintains a dream journal, which helps him keep track of images and ideas that spring to mind during sleep. Additionally, he has a notebook where he jots down any and every stray notion that springs to mind during the workday. however irrelevant these notions may seem. He's always waiting for connections to form and tie together different ideas and visuals as they reveal themselves. Now, concerning his plotting process, he maps out a story and then returns to change it numerous times so that by the time he completes a book, dozens of changes have been made. Furthermore, he is respectful of the fact that narratives change and should change in the process of writing a book, which can easily take a year to a year and a half. You see, experiences change one's point of view, which in turn tweaks and changes the story. And due to this fluidity in the process, he can't imagine ever starting a story with all the elements all fleshed out, following the same structure throughout that year to a year and a half process. Now, he does confess that he is indeed a workaholic and has a tendency to very easily get bored with his own company if he's not exploring various areas of his imagination. Thus, the day he delivers a book, he immediately starts on something new. Now, he writes longhand, enjoying the act of writing, relishing the motion of the hand moving across the page. It's simple, requiring nothing in the way of preparation. It's been his preferred method since he first began writing. Now, writing longhand is also useful to him in that it's economical. Contrary to using a computer, when writing longhand, one has an innate tendency to make sure that every word counts, as that will be quite beneficial in the process of cutting things away. 3 handwritten drafts are completed before it's typed up. Roughly 20% of the first draft appears on the second draft. Additionally, each draft not only differs from one another, but they also serve separate objections. The first draft, it's a collection of all the creativity spilling out of him. The second draft is more about shaping the dialogue, the characters, while the third serves to refine the wording, fluidize the prose, make the funny parts more funny, the scary parts more scary. Quote, horror fiction without violence doesn't do a great deal for me. I think that death and wounding need to be in the air. You've got to get the reader on this ghost train ride, and there's got to be something vile at the end of it, or else why aren't you on the roller coaster instead? And I like to be able to deliver the violence. There's never going to be any evasion. Whether it be sexual subject matter, whether it be violence, I'm going to show it as best I can. End quote. The year was 1983. Clive Barker and his partner John found a modest apartment on 29 Mount View Road in the Crouch End section of North London, with a reputation for making great things happen within the realm of horror fiction. It was the very same place where legendary horror writer Peter Straub wrote his breakthrough novel Ghost Story in 1979. Even more precise, it was the same apartment where, after a visit to Peter Straub, Stephen King wrote the short story Crouch End, published in 1980. Now, regarding the macabre, it was also the place where serial killer Dennis Nilsen murdered male prostitutes and drifters, burying their corpses in his drain. So this seemed like the perfect place for Clive to push the limits of horror fiction, the perfect place to write books of blood. A short rewind to 1981, when feeling overwhelmed by the long and intense hours working as a playwright, he felt the need for an outlet. Now, seeking this outlet, he began writing stories at every opportunity possible. It was an exercise in creativity, something he did to show his friends or simply for his own pleasure. Now, since he had no intention of showing these stories to anyone other than the occasional friend, he allowed himself total liberty when it came to themes and methods of execution. He had no particular plans for these creations. Well, while in a bookstore one day, he just so happened to stumble upon a hefty new anthology of original horror fiction titled Dark Forces. Isaac Bashevis Singer, Stephen King, Ramsey Campbell, Ray Bradbury, Joyce Carol Oates, among others, adorned the front cover. Taken aback, all these writers, various voices, all in the same book. The possibilities seemed endless. He understood that if this book could be published, there just might be a market for his short stories. He later referred to himself as arrogant when he contemplated the idea that he could possibly write an anthology just like Dark Forces. One catch: it was himself playing the part of all the various writers and voices on his own. He'd include some humor, some sexy material, some visceral ideas, some weirdness, and so on. Now, since no one told him not to do so, and given that no one told him short stories didn't really sell, he began writing more horror stories armed with a sense of fresh inspiration and devotion. Now, the stories were all written in a relatively short span, approximately 2 years. Now, what made it easier was how he'd had the stories rummaging in his mind for a while before deciding to put them on paper. And one of these stories was In the Hills and the Cities, a story about two towns that turn into giants. He quite often wrote stories in high states of excitement. He cried a significant amount when writing his stories, yet he also laughed a great deal. As a part of his process, he also read everything aloud as he wrote, acting out each part, which meant he seldom wrote with anyone else in the house on account of hating to be overheard in performance. And later he admitted that, at times, he would find himself disturbed by his own writing. Disturbed, yes, but never frightened. Now, after completing 5 stories, he passed them along to his theatrical agent, Vern Conway. Conway, in turn, offered the manuscript to Livia Galanche at Victor Galanche, a major hardcover publisher. And Galanche was deeply disturbed by the first 5 stories and informed Barker's camp that they wanted nothing to do with any of the stories. Conway then submitted the stories to Spear Books, an independent paperback publisher. Now, Spear set a lunch and told them how much they liked the 5 stories and that they would be willing to publish anything else they had. Well, Barker and Conway informed Spear that those 5 stories were all they had. Now, Spear urged Barker to come back with more, so he began writing. He returned with 18 stories spread over more than 500 pages by 1983, and by that time he found his title, Books of Blood. And the editors at Spear expressed their genuine interest. One condition, however: for the right price. Reason being that, though horror fiction had become successful, much of that success was by way of help from novels by Stephen King, James Herbert, and Peter Straub. You see, British and American publishers considered horror fiction a profitable marketing category. Unfortunately, however, that market seemed to be dwindling again by 1983. And for this reason, Spear considered Barker's stories with cautious optimism. Nevertheless, impressed by his original literary voice, they took the gamble with hopes of stirring interest. At first, the stories were divided into 3 more easily digestible books, seeing as one large 500-page book wouldn't only be too much of a challenge for the average horror readers, but also the cover price could be seen as a deterrent. As a final touch, his name was added to the title. Now, in a rather gutsy move, Spear simultaneously published Clive Barker's Books of Blood in 3 volumes in March of 1984, foregoing any advertising, promotion, or expectations. And the power of these Books of Blood lay in the boldness of their images. Never before had horror, or any fiction for that matter, been so openly explicit about sex and violence, or so clearly intertwined the two. Take, for example, Rawhead Rex, a story involving a baby-eating monster with a sick sexual appetite. Then there's Son of Celluloid, taking matters to a level never before seen in mainstream fiction by telling the tale of a cinema cancer that spawns bloodthirsty replicas of classic film actors. Now, the stories did indeed terrify and disturb. However, Barker never wrote the stories with this intention in mind. Rather, the intention was to excite. His mentality viewed them as adrenaline stories, exercises in how far and how bad things could get, yet still get the reader to want to keep turning those pages. It wasn't just about being gross and extreme. It was about striking a balance so that the reader didn't get lost along the way. In the autumn of 1985, all the hard work, all the chances taken were beginning to be recognized as Clive Barker was presented with the British Fantasy Award and the World Fantasy Award, each honoring Clive Barker's Books of Blood as the best collection of 1984. Almost simultaneously, Sphere issued a set of 3 new Books of Blood in paperback. Then there was the 3rd, the 4th, the 5th, and 6th volumes, written for the most part while he drafted the Damnation game. These volumes presented stronger narrative structures and a decided maturation of style. He was relying more often on craft than sheer explicitness of imagery to convey the horrors. He himself prefers the 2nd series to the original, finding it richer, more confident, more steeped in paradox and metaphysics, and, on an intimate level, far more vicious. Still, that first Books of Blood, well, that's where it all began, cementing his name as a writer to be reckoned with. Horror fiction would never be the same again. As usual, let's end this episode with a quote, this one from the Prince of Darkness himself. I want to be able to surprise myself, even shock myself, whether it be sexual content, whether it be about the theological content, whatever. I want to be able to knock myself sideways. Otherwise, what a waste of a life that would be. End quote. Thank you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed this episode and will spread the word about the podcast. Once again, I have been your host, Jason Nemore Harden. We here at House of Words ask that you please consider helping to make this show easier to produce and more frequent by contributing on our Patreon page at patreon.com/houseofwords or paypal.me/houseofwordspodcast. Alternatively, you can like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube page and encourage others who may find what we offer interesting to do the same at House of Words Podcast. Every little bit helps, more than you might think. Until next time, keep turning those pages.
House of Words is written and produced by Cristo M. Sanchez. Narrated and written by me, Jason Nemore Harden. And music by Creature 9 and Wood. All rights and ownership belong to Cristo M. Sanchez and Jason Nemore Harden.